Jack Reacher caught the last of the summer sun in a small town on the coast of Maine, and then, like the birds in the sky above him, he began his long migration south. But not, he thought, straight down the coast. Not like the orioles and the buntings and the phoebes and the warblers and the ruby-throated hummingbirds. Instead, he decided on a diagonal route, south and west, from the top right-hand corner of the country to the bottom left, maybe through Syracuse and Cincinnati and St. Louis and Oklahoma City and Albuquerque and onward, all the way to San Diego, which for an Army guy like Reacher was a little too full of Navy people, but which was otherwise a fine spot to start the winter. It would be an epic road trip, and one he hadn't made in years. He was looking forward to it. He didn't get far.
Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hello and welcome to the Good Reading podcast. Angus Dalton here with you. Someone buys one of Lee Child's Jack Reacher thriller novels every 20 seconds, and that's on an off day. He unleashed Jack Reacher, the brawny, nomadic, 6'5" ex-military cop, in 1997 with the publication of his debut novel, Killing Floor. Since then, Jack Reacher has featured in 23 Lee Child thrillers. There are at least 100 million copies of these books in print. Lee lives in New York, but he's in Australia to talk about the latest Jack Reacher book, Past Tense. Lee, hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Good to be with you, Angus.
So, profiles of you, of which there are numerous, usually begin with some remark about your height, as you're rather tall. But it would seem today the more newsworthy topic concerns the height of Tom Cruise. What is going on there?
Well, back in 2005, we were offered a movie deal, and that immediately introduces you to a binary decision. Do you want a movie or not? And I love the movies, I absolutely do. And I thought that to have some little thing of mine in the world of movies, in the history of movies, was just irresistible. So I said, yeah, great. And there was the usual amalgam of executive producers. You know, lots of production companies pile in and co-finance the thing and co-organize the thing. And one of those companies was Cruise Wagner, which at the time was Tom Cruise's production company. And nothing happened then for about 6 years. It was in what they call development. And then in 2011, a screenplay was written by Christopher McQuarrie, who was an Oscar-winning screenwriter for The Usual Suspects. And it was a fabulous screenplay. And it circulates, obviously, amongst all the interested parties, including all those executive producers. And Tom Cruise read it as an executive producer and thought, wow, this is a great screenplay. And this is a great character. I want to play this guy. So we were all happy for him to do it because he's a fabulous actor, a really, really hard worker. And what people really don't know about Tom, because it's hidden behind everything else he does, he's a fabulous theoretician of story. He really gets story. He loves story. Working with him is an education in itself for a storyteller. So we made the first movie and then the second movie, and they were both really good, both really solid. I was very happy with them. But the readership of my books never, ever really warmed to the physical mismatch between Jack Reacher and Tom Cruise. Reacher is a huge, intimidating bruiser, 6'5", which is nearly 2 meters. He's about the size of a lock forward in an international rugby side. You know, imagine an All Black or a Australian rugby player, big, intimidating, probably a bit ugly sort of a guy. And, Cruise is none of that. And the thing about readers, the public as a whole, consumers of any entertainment product, you cannot tell them what to think. They will make up their own mind. They are infinitely stubborn. They have their own view. And throughout, they never really warmed up to that physical mismatch. And so we decided, all right, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to do feature films with Tom Cruise because times had moved on. Between 2005 and now, 13 years later, nearly 14 years later since the deal was done, the landscape has changed completely. We have this new streaming television thing, which then led to what they call binge watching, which is a completely new thing. I mean, it was not around in 2005. Nobody saw it coming. And it is, people call it novelistic, which is not really very accurate in my opinion, other than the length of time that you're invited to spend. But it's probably an infinitely better way of putting a novel on the screen. And so there's no question that if we were coming to it fresh now, that's the option we would take. So what we're doing is rebooting it, really. We're taking it away from the hour-and-a-half or 2-hour movie format into 10 to 12 hours of a streaming season, and we're going to use a new actor to finally try and say to the readers, okay, let's have a proper physical facsimile of Reacher on the screen. So that's where we're at now. And, I feel I'm going to miss working with Cruise. He's a lovely guy. He's a fabulous actor. And as I said, he's a really interesting guy to listen to on the subject of storytelling. So I want him to still be involved as an executive producer, which he will be, I'm sure. And but the product is going to look different on the screen.
Yeah. I did see yesterday on your Facebook page, you put out the simple question to your fans, who would you like to see take the reins in portraying? And there was a cool 10,000 people discussing that question in the comments. So people are obviously invested.
Yeah, they really are. And I want them to be. That's the exact word. I want them to be invested. I want them to have ownership. Because in a very real sense, the reader has ownership of the story. Because reading is a really curious thing. It's not like screen entertainment. It's not like music. It's not like anything else in which the product washes over the consumer, just comes at them and washes over them. Reading is a two-way street. Reading is ultimately about the reader interrogating the text, at which point the story emerges in the reader's head. The reader's mental energy is being burned. The reader's calories are being used. It's the reader creating the story at that point. They literally have ownership of it. So I want them to have a feeling of ownership of who plays the characters. So I would love it if we have some kind of mass suggestion forum or some polling or some participation, let the readers decide.
Yeah, and I guess that investment and everything that you've just talked about is why the book is always better than the movie, Tom Cruise or otherwise.
Yeah, isn't that the case? I mean, I think literally you could say I've seen maybe 2 movies in my life that are better than the book, simply because the compression kind of organizes what maybe was a fairly rambling text. But they are the tiniest minority.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the book is always better. And that is because the reader is inventing it. It's the reader's own vision that they're seeing. And when you see somebody else's vision, it never quite matches.
Absolutely. Lee, here in Australia, we like to blame the influence of Rupert Murdoch for a lot of things. I'll spare you the details. But in a way, can we thank Mr. Murdoch for your career jump into thriller writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happened was there was a very well-established terrestrial duopoly in television in Britain that actually was producing some really, really fine work. But Mr. Murdoch wanted his satellite service to gain a foothold in Britain, and so he effectively bribed the Thatcher government to, in exchange for overt support in his newspapers, he wanted the government to wreck and destroy that established duopoly in order to allow his satellite service to get in there, to get in the gap. And so obediently, the Conservative government did that. They attacked the television industry, destroyed the union. They removed what was technically a cap on level of profit, which of course then tempted the owners to go for maximum profit. And one of the ways they did that was to fire all the old expensive veterans like me. I was 39 years old. I had a great salary. I had a pension. I had benefits. I had free life insurance. I had a parking spot, all that kind of traditional stuff. And we were all thrown out of work. And I was then on the outside faced with the decision, okay, what to do next? And I thought, can I afford to retire? And unfortunately, I fell, several $100,000 short, and so I had to do something else. And I thought, what can I do that keeps me in that broad equation of entertainment? How can I preserve that transaction of doing something that other people were going to be enjoying, were going to be happy about. That's all I've ever wanted to do something that gives somebody else simple pleasure for an hour or a day or a week. What could I do? And completely independently from that, I had been a reader all my life. All my life, I absolutely depended on, survived on, loved reading. And strangely, I had never really inquired of myself, where do these books come from? I really hadn't. I just assumed they were kind of there to be enjoyed. But in the last 5 or so years of my television career, I had started to really think about it, because I'd picked up the John D. MacDonald books about Travis McGee, which are fabulous entertainment, wonderful novels, great stories. But for me, somehow, maybe it was the right thing at the right time, I'm not sure. For me, they also acted as a blueprint. I could see what he was doing, and I could see why he was doing it and how he was doing it. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, I can. Maybe I'd like to write a book. And of course I didn't, because I was busy with my day job. And how people ever write with a day job, I don't know. I admire them very much for that. But when the day job came to an end, I said to myself, well, you've been saying this for 5 years now. This is the time to actually do it. Put up or shut up.
Your latest novel, Past Tense, begins as Jack Reacher is at a literal fork in the road. One path is going to lead him through to Portsmouth, which is quite a large city in New Hampshire. The other to Laconia, which is where his father was born. And in typical decisive Jack Reacher manner, he takes the path towards his past in a way. And that made me think that when you did lose that TV job, you were sort of at a fork at the road as well, like all, I guess, newly unemployed people are. Where do you think that other fork would have led you if you hadn't grabbed a notepad and pencil?
That's a great question, because I would have just been on the general employment market, and it was pretty dismal at the time, actually. I signed up for unemployment benefit, obviously, and part of doing that is that you're required to hunt down any vacancies that they advertise. And literally the only vacancy where I lived was a warehouse man for some kind of distribution center. So if I hadn't have chosen to write the books, I'd probably be wearing a sort of brown canvas coat, packing pallets to load on a truck.
Wow. And instead you're here in beautiful Sydney in a leather jacket talking about your fantastic thriller novels. Wow, how life plays out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all about taking that right fork in the road at the right time.
Absolutely. You're perhaps the most famous adherent to the pantser style of writing. And if people aren't familiar with that phrase, there's usually sort of two disciplines, the plotters who plan everything out and the pantsers who just go for it on the seat of their pants. Does that mean that when you're writing, you give orders to Jack Reacher, or are you just following him along?
It's a fabulous question, that too, because, obviously in one sense, Reacher is not actually real, and I'm the one sitting there doing the typing. So how is he leading me along? What it really is about, I think, is you're just throwing yourself off a building and hurtling through the air, but you're trusting that everything you've read before, everything that, every movie you've seen, every TV show you've seen has somehow influenced you to the point where you can trust that you can instinctively construct a suspenseful and compelling tale. And I think, that was my advantage, that I had always been a huge reader, literally from early childhood. Compulsive reader, loved it, just lived in books, and then working so long in television, it kind of imprints on your brain the rhythms of cliffhangers, the pacing, the grammar of storytelling. So I rely just on faith that I'm gonna make it. The way I describe it to myself is I feel like a movie stuntman. I've jumped off the top of the building, and I'm sincerely hoping that the crew are going to maneuver the airbag into position before I hit the ground.
So in Past Tense, Jack goes to sort of investigate his family history. Is Past Tense a more personal Reacher novel than the rest?
Slightly it is, because, and people are probably going to make too much out of this, but my own father had died just before I started writing it. And it's not that I was in any way upset or traumatized or anything like that. You know, the old guy was in terrible shape. He was in that situation. He just lived too long. You know, he'd actually should have died about 4 years previously, but intervention came too soon and they revived him, and he had a miserable last 4 years. So it wasn't that I was upset. I was actually glad and relieved that it was over for him. But it did lead me to ruminate, you know, look back over our relationship. Obviously, by definition, I'd known him all my life. He was my dad. But it did occur to me, how well did I know him? How well does anybody know anybody? Even a close relative, you know, your partner, your children. How well do we know them? And it seemed to me impossible that we could know them 100%. They must have hidden aspects, hidden strands in their life, maybe secrets, maybe something going on that we would never know. So I was kind of speculating about that. What could there be about Reacher's father that he didn't know? And so it was really an exploration of that theme.
Yeah, it is interesting in the point in someone's life where they become interested in their parents' past. A bit like realizing that there's an author behind every book. You realize there's a life behind your parents, and then
and you know, grandparents behind that. And just parenthetically, there's a really interesting strand of literature right now I think it's called third generation memoir. It's a lot of people investigating their grandparents' generation, especially the sort of people that were caught up in World War II. Then the offspring, the descendants, are suddenly interested in them, and they reconstruct those lives. And I really wish that everybody, all of us, you, everybody, should write down just a few pages about their families, because we're losing history. We're losing all that knowledge.
Yeah, especially as maybe that sort of third generation memoir thing is a symptom of how generations are becoming more and more different from each other. So it's perhaps becoming more and more fascinating to look back.
Yes, indeed. And especially when we live kind of comfortable lives, really. We live quite bland and cheerful lives. And you look back to the real moments of drama in recent years and think, well, yes, our relatives lived through that.
Coming back to Past Tense, can you tell me about this Canadian couple that come along in their dingy car?
Yeah, and that is, you know, you mentioned that I'm a pantster, and absolutely I am, and I've learned to rely on subliminal or subconscious triggers. And in that first paragraph, I say, Reacher has spent the end of the summer in Maine. And so I thought, Maine, what is that? Oh, Stephen King lives in Maine. And so could it be possible could I do a sort of Stephen King strand where we have this pleasant but rather hapless and hopeless Canadian couple, youngsters. They're driving all the way from a remote spot in Canada to New York City because they've got something valuable to sell. And they're poor and their car is rubbish, so that it breaks down right by this lonely motel in the woods. And everything looks kind of okay. It's a pleasant enough place, but somehow, like with a Stephen King novel, we know that something really bad must be happening there. I thought, could I do that? So I wanted to develop a pure kind of creepy suspense strand with that. And actually, in a lot of ways, that took over the book. I really liked those two Canadians, and I suppose subconsciously I imagined that Reacher would have to intervene at some point, but he actually shows up much later than I might have imagined. They do fine on their own. They manage on their own almost to the end.
Yeah, and you're contributing there to the collective terror I think a lot of over-imaginative people have about rural motels.
Yeah.
Exclusively creepy.
They must be. I mean, it's just like a trope, isn't it? That if there is a motel in the woods, there's got to be something wrong with it.
Out of interest, have you sent along a copy of Past Tense to Stephen King?
Yeah, we read each other's new books all the time, which is easier for him than me because he writes so much.
Yeah. Did he enjoy Past Tense?
I believe he did. Yeah, you know, he's a Reacher fan, and he's mentioned Reacher in one of his books. Under the Dome, somebody shows up and with a sort of job recommendation from Reacher.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Has Reacher ever made it to our sunny shores here in Australia?
Well, in the back of the Australian edition of Past Tense, I wrote a special short story for Australia. Reacher does come down to Sydney. He's here for about 5 hours. He gets off a plane, he takes care of some business and gets back on the plane.
Fantastic. Is there any dangling from the tip of the Sydney Opera House sail?
It is. It is actually set at the Opera House.
Oh, there you go. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, can't wait to read it. Lee, I would love to know which books you have been reading lately.
I read an awful lot of advanced editions, of people's first novels, especially who want support or want blurbs. And I've just read a couple of really good ones. One was called Save Me from Dangerous Men by a writer called S.A. Lelchuk, which was a pretty hard-hitting, pretty hard-boiled story. And right now I'm just about to finish Taylor Stevens' new one, which is called Liar's Paradox, which again is it's a fabulous book. It's very sophisticated. It's quite deep. It's an espionage and action drama, but also a family drama.
Fantastic. They sound great. Is it true that Bill Clinton bugs you for writing advice?
No, he never bugged me for advice. I think that what he does is he reads the Reacher books and likes them. And he sends me a little note usually about what he thinks about each one. And then when his book with James Patterson came out called The President is Missing, which is actually a pretty good book too, the fashion now in America and elsewhere is, instead of doing solo presentations at bookstores, they like to do conversations on stage. So he called me and said, would I be the interviewer for their event in Philadelphia? So I said, sure, and it was wonderful because it meant that this is an ex-president of the United States and he's required to answer my questions. It was wonderful. And then when my own book launch came up at the beginning of November, again, I was asked to do an on-stage conversation, and I thought, well, who should I do it with? And I said to my people, well, call Bill Clinton. He owes me a favor now. And he did. He showed up, and we did the on-stage interview together.
That's fantastic. So it sounds like that your training as a writer came completely from those books that you were reading all through childhood. What are the ones that you remember?
I was a very normal reader. I'm not one of these guys that claims to have read Dostoevsky when I was 7. I read I started with Enid Blyton and Just William and W.E. Johns and all of those normal ones. And then by the time I was about 9 or 10, I was moving on to Alistair MacLean. I would say Alistair MacLean was my first really big influence because I loved the sort of comfortable storytelling style of the guy. He really sort of put his arm around your shoulder and told you the story. And I loved his heroes who were almost too good to be true. He had a real knack of pushing them right to the edge of cartoonishness without ever letting them fall off. And I was impressed by the way he did that. They were wholeheartedly attractive people, but not quite too good to be true. And I think I took some lessons from that. And then I moved on, of course, to the Americans, John D. MacDonald and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and so on. But in general, I was just a mad reader. I would read anything, and I still do. I just read a book about the history of air conditioning. I read a book called Geometric Patterns in Medieval English Brickwork. I'll read anything. I'm just fascinated by knowledge, by learning things, by experiencing different things, which you can. With a book, you've got the whole world in your hand. You can live anywhere at any time through a book.
Fantastic, even in the inner machinations of an air conditioner.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, air conditioning is really, it created parts of the world. Parts, Florida, for instance, parts of the southern USA, air conditioning permitted that development because suddenly places were habitable. Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, was a steamy, fetid, mosquito-infested swamp. Government workers who worked in D.C. got hazard pay because it was so bad. And then air conditioning really changed all of that.
Yeah, I guess anything is fascinating in the hands of a good writer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Nonfiction is storytelling just like anything else, and it can be just as compelling.
Absolutely. You said recently that you would never write books for kids. Why?
Because kids are just the most vicious audience, Adult readers are pretty tough, but they're socialized to the point where they're at least polite about it. If kids don't like you, they're going to tell you. And I'm not sure I want to expose myself to that kind of withering criticism.
Fair enough. As a last question, I put out to my very sprawling and very bookish family that I was interviewing Lee Child and did they have any questions. And I'm so sorry to report that the most erudite question comes from my brother, who would love to know your thoughts on how a fight would play out between Jack Reacher and Jason Bourne.
Yeah, well, that is an interesting question, really, on two levels. Number one, obviously, Jack Reacher would win. He would win with his head in a bag and one hand tied behind him. But of course, the real point is, generally speaking, when people ask those who would win questions, actually no fight would take place, because generally speaking, Reacher and whoever it was would be on a similar wavelength. And they're much more likely to have a cup of coffee together and then team up against the real bad guys than to fight each other. But, of course, Jason Bourne is a very interesting exception to that question, because he is, mentally damaged in some way. So he may not be able to react in what would be a rational manner. So he may well try and fight Reacher, in which case that is a very, very foolish step.
Absolutely. Well, there you go, Liam. You've got your answer. Lee Child, thank you so much for chatting to me. I've absolutely loved reading Past Tense and talking to you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Angus.
Past Tense by Lee Child is published by Bantam Press. It's out now in all good bookshops, including Good Reading's online bookshop at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. If you'd like to support the Good Reading podcast, leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice. And if you're interested in the print edition of Good Reading, just visit our website for subscription details. Thanks for listening.